Chapter 141, The Arbat Incident, Part 20. On the rooftop of Stark Tower, Schiller put the stopper on a jar containing a clump of black slime. Gray Mist was communicating with Venom via telepathy. Venom said, "Don't you feel any guilt for deceiving such a naive kid? It's as if you're not an accomplice. If he had enough negative emotions to trigger the dark tide of fear, I wouldn't have resorted to this drastic measure." And Schiller paused, then said to Venom, "I've discovered you have great potential as a movie director. The scene you made up about Stark's death really scared Peter. I know that scoundrel too well. He only knows one trick from beginning to end, and it's bound to come true sooner or later." Schiller sighed, more as if to relax, and said, "I really didn't expect those multiverse guys to come so early. If I don't scare them away with this trick, there will never be peace again." Venom said, "Our deal is done. Now you should be able to choose a host for myself, right?" "Of course, but given your dangerousness and uncontrollability, you can only choose one of the hosts you have already parasitized. So who are you going to choose? Stark? Bruce? Or reporter?" "I choose that reporter," Venom roared decisively. "Oh, I almost forgot, you also parasitized a human journalist. Okay, I'll ship you to his house tomorrow. But just like we agreed, you'd better not change hosts easily, and don't go around eating human heads on the streets, or I'll have the Gray Mist bite you." Venom emitted a nasal sound remarkably similar to Stark's, filled with reluctance. After standing on the rooftop for a while, footsteps soon came from behind. Nick walked over and stood next to Schiller. Nick said, "This time you've caused quite a commotion, haven't you?" "What? This is beyond your expectations, director." "I'm not the director. Just like you, do you want to call yourself a stagehand? Isn't that so?" Schiller didn't turn to look at Nick, but kept his eyes on the lights of the New York skyline. He said, "Don't tell me that the growing popularity of the Bat God among vampires in recent years is just a coincidence. Don't tell me that the prophecy of the arrival of the Bat God was just a coincidence, right on the eve of the moderates' attempt to manipulate the election. Who knows? There are just so many coincidences in this world. Yes, it's a coincidence exclusive to S.H.I.E.L.D., and you have the final say on everything." "Let's talk about the good news," Nick said, arms crossed. "The bats infected with the lizard serum are no longer usable, right? The raw materials are becoming increasingly scarce, and we're facing difficulties in starting production. Where should the sanatorium be located? It's still Manhattan, it's closer to their homes. However, it's too late to build a new sanatorium. There's an old bank there built in the 1930s, and its new owner went out of business because he couldn't pay the inheritance tax. Construction will start there tomorrow. How much usable bat material is left? The police and S.H.I.E.L.D. agents have suffered heavy casualties on the battlefield. We can send out less than 1/10 of them to pursue the suspects, and many of those are untrained green recruits who can't even hold a gun properly. The freeze gun's fuel supply is also running low, so we can't do anything about it." "So how many did you report?" "Only 12 left. We only have 12 precious bats with immortality factors left." Nick shrugged. "Too many," Schiller said without thinking. "Let's leave too. Connors has some good long-term cryopreservation technology. Freeze the remaining 10 and put them in your S.H.I.E.L.D. warehouse. We'll sell them slowly after the price has increased 1,000-fold. "Isn't that a bit of an exaggeration? Several thousand armed police officers and hundreds of S.H.I.E.L.D. agents, and they only managed to capture 2 bats when the bats were defeated. Thousands of people and hundreds of special agents? You're underestimating the brutality of this war. By the time of the final pursuit, only 10 armed police officers and 1 special agent remained. That's not an exaggeration, is it? Okay. But the problem is Natasha, Coulson, Hawkeye, and Daisy all have to go out on missions soon. Which of them are you planning to sacrifice?" Nick asked. "Don't even think about excuses like injuries. Hawkeye has been injured more than 80 times this year, and his medical insurance coverage has been used up 4 times over. Daisy has also been seriously injured more than 20 times. Schiller touched his forehead and said, "It's not even summer yet, and you've already reimbursed all their quotas. Don't you really plan to leave any redundancy for unexpected situations? Emergency? Emergency is a daily occurrence at S.H.I.E.L.D. Okay, if you're willing to raise my consultation fee a little bit more, I'll try to convince Osborn and Stark to take on the project to rebuild the Brooklyn Bridge. In the name of charity? There's not much room for maneuver here, after all. Everyone can see the bridge being built. If this scale of charity doesn't meet your needs, Then go ahead with a larger scale one. You should know that better than I do. Schiller waved his hand and said, sending war correspondents, filming post-war ruins, publicizing the horrors of war, mobilizing charitable organizations, hosting fundraising dinners, attracting celebrities, socialites, brands, and political parties. If this is still not enough, then let's announce a sanction against vampires. Nick sighed and said, so far, our approach remains conservative, for many reasons. The Security Council will not agree to launch large-scale sanctions. If you were willing to give them one of your 2 precious raw materials, I think they would be tempted, right? You're planning to deceive even your own people? Don't talk nonsense. There were only 2 to begin with. The remaining 10 are just S.H.I.E.L.D.'s emergency reserve funds, which they just haven't had time to monetize yet. On the rooftop of Stark Tower, Schiller and Nick gazed at the dazzling New York City skyline. Inside Stark Tower, Stark lay in his hospital bed, wrapped up like a mummy. He watched Peter walk back and forth in front of him and said, hey, stop spinning me. You're making me dizzy. When exactly is the doctor arriving? There shouldn't be any traffic at this time, right? Peter had barely finished speaking when Strange's voice, accompanied by footsteps, appeared outside the door. He said, how I wish I were seeing a corpse named Stark. He walked in, looking sleepy, clearly having been woken up in the middle of the night. He irritably adjusted the monitoring equipment beside him. Peter, peering in, asked tentatively, Dr. Strange, is Mr. Stark all right? He was quite badly injured. If he were really seriously injured, you would be seeing the pastor now, not me. Strange roughly pulled the pillow off Stark's head, causing Stark's head to hit the corner of the bed. He screamed, you quack! Are you trying to murder me? I may be unscrupulous, but I am definitely not a quack doctor. Stark muttered a few words and said, you doctors are all the same. All right, the checkup is done. You're fine and should live to see the end. Pay up and then take me back to sleep. Stark looked him up and down and said, what did you check? You just turned the equipment on and off. Don't think I don't know these things. Who do you think you are dealing with? I am Stark. Don't try to fool me. Strange said impatiently, then you can check yourself. Take me back. Don't rush off. I have a big business deal to discuss with you. Schiller appeared at the door, handing Strange a proposal. Strange took it, glanced at it, and said, Stark Osborne Associates? General Counsel appointment? What kind of company is this? Strange asked in confusion. How come I didn't know that Stark and Osborne had joined forces, and that it was a pharmaceutical company? He flipped through the job offer and said, besides, I'm a neurosurgeon. I'm not going to be a drug salesman. You might as well turn to the last page and look at that number. Strange looked up at Schiller, flipped to the last page of the offer letter with some skepticism, and then focused his gaze on the number. In a second, he closed the offer letter, coughed twice, straightened his collar, stuffed the offer letter into his briefcase, and said, I am currently employed by New York Presbyterian Hospital, and my contract has not expired. You cannot make me violate the spirit of my contract. I know, of course I know, and I'm a very contract-conscious person myself, Schiller said with a smile. The staff cafe upstairs should still be open. We might as well go there to discuss things in detail. After the 2 doctors left, Stark and Peter stared at each other, and Stark said, so, what about my test? At that moment, Connors walked in. He had heard what Stark said and said, although it has been several years since my last clinical trial, I can still reluctantly examine you. Oh no, wait, no need, I think I'm fine. Don't worry, I have extensive experience in battlefield medics. With that, he walked over and suddenly lowered the upper part of Stark's bed, causing Stark to cry out in pain from the jolting motion. Peter hesitated, wanting to step forward and stop Connors' violence, but Connors glanced at him and said, Peter, Dr. Ethan wants you to come up. He probably has something to say. Peter paused for a few seconds, first looking at Stark, who was covered in bandages, then at Connors, whose scales had not yet faded, before running away in a flash under Stark's indignant gaze. Stark slammed his fist on the bed with his only usable left hand and said, that heartless bastard, if it weren't for saving him, I wouldn't be injured like this. Holding up a diagnostic report, Connors said, now we have good news and bad news. Which do you want to hear first? Don't play that game with me. Let's talk about it all at once. The good news is that there's really nothing wrong with your spine and nervous system. The bad news is that the problem is with that thing in your chest. Stark stiffened for a moment, then said, "There's nothing wrong with this thing on my chest." Ethan explained to me the basic principle of the reactor on your chest. Although my expertise lies in biology, I also have some knowledge of mechanics and physics. Your physical examination report tells me that there are serious problems with this thing. In your pursuit of greater power for the mecha, you used too much palladium. It seems that if you don't come up with a solution sooner or later, you will die from poisoning. Stark turned his head away. Clearly, he didn't want to discuss the matter. Connors put down the report, looked Stark in the eye and said, "You understand this better than anyone, but you just won't change. I'm sure your friends have all tried to persuade you, but you're the most stubborn person I've ever met." Chapter 142, The Arbat Incident. And, "You mean, there's something wrong with the reactor in Mr. Stark's chest?" Peter asked, looking at Ethan. "Peter, you're very smart." Ethan put his arm around Peter's shoulder, turned to look at him and said, "Even if you just think about it for a moment, you should understand how dangerous it would be to have an energy source that works on this principle embedded in your body." Peter said with great concern, "What should we do then? Shouldn't we be able to develop something new to replace that thing?" Of course, Tony is a genius. If he really wants to do something, he can succeed. But what if he doesn't want to? How could he not think about it? This is a matter of his own life. Peter stopped short of saying this. Ethan said, "You should have noticed that Tony's mindset is a bit negative now. He's always thinking about dying like a hero instead of thinking about how to live well." Peter recalled Stark's resolute flight towards the Highland Tower, refusing to stop no matter how Peter tried to dissuade him. This posture, besides being heroic, did indeed have the air of rushing towards death. Peter sighed, sat down in his chair, put one arm on the table and said, "I heard from Dr. Schiller about what Mr. Stark has been going through lately, and frankly, it must be very sad. What do you think I should do?" Peter spread his hands and said, "I want to help him, but I probably can't be of much help technically. Stark doesn't need anyone's technical help. I think you could try to persuade him." Ethan leaned against the lab table next to Peter and looked at him, saying, "Haven't you noticed? Stark treats you differently. We're his friends, but there are some things he never listens to his friends' advice on. But you might be different." After Ethan left, Peter, alone in the lab, stood there in a daze, reminiscing about the moments he had spent with Stark. Initially, at the top of the New York Tower, Stark told him about his experiences in Afghanistan. That day, when they were still strangers, Stark told Peter that wanting to be a hero would hurt. It wasn't until later that Peter realized Stark wasn't someone who would easily cry out in pain. Peter could imagine that having a reactor embedded in his chest, no matter how powerful it was or how strong the mech it could power, would be an unpleasant experience for the body's owner. The laboratory was dimly lit, with only the light from the instruments intertwining on the floor. Spider-Man wasn't immune to fatigue. In this environment, Peter, who had been fighting all day, also felt tired and sleepy. In a daze, he seemed to see Stark sitting on the ground in front of him, leaning against the experimental table, holding a model of a reactor in his hand. Peter remembered asking Stark what the model that always sat on his desk was. Stark remained silent for a long time, but finally only said one name, Howard. Peter had vaguely heard the name from others. For example, Steve told Peter that Howard was his old comrade in arms, a genius, but also a womanizer. Natasha seemed to have mentioned the name as well, but she didn't say anything nice about it. Nick also mentioned Stark's father, but he didn't offer any comments that would impress Peter. Just like his own father, Peter thought, all he ever heard from Uncle Ben and Aunt May was a name and some vague description. Father, Peter thought that word was really far removed from him. Peter grew increasingly drowsy, as if in a dream. He saw Stark put down the model, then close his eyes, just like he was asleep. On every such late night, in the deserted laboratory of Stark Tower, Iron Man does indeed feel pain. He always said that Howard wouldn't be the person he should think of when he was in pain, but no one knows who Iron Man actually thinks of in the dead of night. In Peter's deeper dream, he dreamed that Stark became his father. This dream lacked the Stark Group's advanced equipment and luxurious environment, and it contained none of the unimaginable extravagance of a wealthy family that Peter could not comprehend. His childhood was still confined to that old house, and his memories are still of clothes that were neither new nor old, toys that could not fill a box, and storybooks that had been turned to crease. But the only difference is that he has a father who takes apart toy cars with him and builds all sorts of machines with building blocks. Together, they treated marbles as planets, arranging them on the somewhat old floor to form a map of the solar system. In the cramped room, The setting sun shone on these rather simple toys. Tall Stark and young Peter stared intently at the glass marbles on the floor, as if the father and son possessed the entire universe. The two men's appearances began to change. Peter saw that Stark had become Howard, and he himself had become a young Stark. Howard gently flicked the marbles, and countless mysteries of the universe flowed from his mouth. The light from those glass marbles began to grow brighter and brighter, becoming increasingly dazzling. Peter saw a father and son standing hand in hand above the earth, controlling all the planets in the solar system. Even the sun obeyed the father's command and dimmed its light. The planets kept rotating, and countless lights flickered. Mars, Venus, Jupiter, those profound facts for children echoed in the silent universe. Before Peter's consciousness went dark, the last thing he remembered was Stark handing him the first Spider-Man suit. Stark's visor rose up, and his brown eyes, illuminated by the sunlight, looked as rich as melting honey. Peter was certain that he saw two completely different emotions in those eyes, the weariness of a father and the innocence of a child. As the night grew deeper, Stark lay in his hospital bed. He was indeed exhausted, but his biological clock, honed by years of staying up late, still prevented him from falling asleep. Just as he was feeling a little uncomfortable and wanted to turn over, he heard the doorknob move slightly. He turned his head with difficulty and saw that the door had been opened a crack, and the light from outside poured in. Peter squeezed through the crack and then gently closed the door. Peter turned around and saw Stark's somewhat gleaming eyes staring at him. He seemed startled, then said somewhat awkwardly, Mr. Stark, you're still awake? I thought. What are you doing here now? Aren't you going to sleep? I have a bit of insomnia, I just can't fall asleep. Actually I've already slept, but I just woke up suddenly. Has anyone ever told you that when you lie, your speech is always incoherent? Peter said dejectedly, I knew it. I've never been able to lie since I was a child. So what are you doing here? If it's anything related to the experiment, we can talk about it tomorrow morning. I was almost asleep. Stark turned over, his back to Peter, indicating that he was going to sleep. Peter lowered his head, didn't turn on the light, and walked to the chair next to the hospital bed and sat down. He remained silent for a long time, so long that he thought Stark was asleep. Then, as if possessed, he said, Mr. Stark, could you tell me about your father? Stark remained silent, and Peter felt he had gone too far, but he still said, I didn't mean anything by it. It's just, I've never met my father. When people hear about my background, they never mention their parents to me again. Not even Gwen. Stark, curled up on the hospital bed, stirred slightly. He heard Peter say, Well, actually, I just had a dream, which is why I can't sleep. I dreamt about my father, but maybe it wasn't really him, since I've never met him, right? Finally, after a long silence, Stark sighed, turned over, stared straight at the ceiling, and said, Howard is an alcoholic. He's drunk every day. When he's drunk, he curses everything and is a rude bastard. When he's sober, the sentence he says to me most often is, You don't understand anything. Of course, I didn't understand anything at all. I was only a few years old then. I have a natural interest in cars and I like to tinker with those metal parts. But when I make something, he never praises me. He just says it's a pile of junk. Alcohol burned out his prized brain, Stark scoffed. So much so that he didn't produce any decent inventions in the final stages of his life. Look at me now. Stark Industries is better than ever. And I've come up with even more world-changing inventions. He's wrong, terribly wrong. It's not that Stark Jr. is clueless. The one who truly knows nothing is him, Howard Stark. Looking at the silent Peter, Stark turned his face away and said, You didn't hear the story you wanted, did you? What did you expect to hear? Our deep father-son bond? Or him teaching me knowledge, guiding me in invention from a young age? Stark lowered his eyes, and when he squinted, his long eyelashes always cast deep shadows in his brown eyes. Peter lowered his head, crossed his hands, covered his chin, and said, Before, I had never dreamed of my father, nor had I ever thought of him, because I had never seen him. There was nothing about him in my memory, and I couldn't even dream of him. Stark glanced at him and said, Well, maybe there were some good times, maybe. A long, long time ago, so long ago that I can't even remember. I remember we were standing together at the lab table. I don't remember exactly what we were doing, but there were times like that. Stark turned his head to look at Peter, but he didn't see any sadness on Peter's face. In Peter's still somewhat childish eyes, there was no loneliness or sadness as he had imagined. Stark thought that perhaps this was normal. Peter had been living like this for over a decade, with his uncle playing the role of a father figure in his life, but perhaps only to a part of it. Ben Parker was an ordinary man who did his best to pass on his best qualities, strength and kindness, to Peter. But Peter is a genius, and Stark knows that all too well. Geniuses need resonance, they need to communicate with worthy opponents, and they need the collision of sparks of thought. When Peter and Stark looked at each other, they both realized that this truly proved the saying. Geniuses are always lonely. Stark saw Peter's gaze fall on the reactor in his chest. He lowered his head and continued to stare at the ceiling, watching the flashes of light outside the window leave various shapes on the ceiling. If this reactor problem isn't fixed, you'll die, right? Peter asked him. That's what Ethan told me. They always make a mountain out of a molehill. Actually, I have nothing wrong with me, You have no idea how I felt when I saw your death in my spider sense, Peter said. Stark detected a slight tremor in his voice. The Stark Tower's laboratory equipment is very advanced. I really like the environment here. The decoration is also very luxurious. I have never lived in such a good place before. But more importantly, no one had ever taught me the knowledge of manufacturing equipment or the methods of experimentation before. No one had ever been with me on the lab bench, assembling those parts and testing those finished products together. When my spider senses told me that this was all going to end, I just couldn't accept it. Peter's voice trailed off, the last syllable falling to the ground, almost crumbling at the slightest touch. Stark closed his eyes, his Adam's apple bobbing, and said, "What do you want me to say? Let me tell you myself, in a year and 3 months, perhaps it will all be over." In Stark's pitch-black vision, he still began to recall those days that were so distant he could hardly remember them, searching for those barely perceptible fragments of memory. He wanted to reminisce about the good times he had with Howard. That very night, as he painstakingly pieced together these fragments of memory from the cracks in the wall, Stark finally admitted that he was missing them. Tonight, his pain was more intense than ever before, and so was his longing. Howard wasn't the person he should think of in his moments of pain, because those good times would never come again, because his father was dead. It was only then that Stark realized that when he went from being a son to a father, he understood that any father would rather live a long, long life than have his child think of him on painful nights, and for the good times to never end. Stark felt his will to survive had never been stronger. He didn't want to become Howard, the person he hated most. I don't want his child to be constantly reminded for the rest of his life that those good times are gone forever and will never come back, through an abrupt death. So his children were forced to forget, to tear apart the happiest and most glorious days of their lives, to hide them in the deepest corners of their memories, and to deny their existence. In the stillness of the night, no one saw that as Stark slept, his fingers, etched with the lines of his no longer young skin, gripped the bed railing tightly, just as he had held that model on countless nights. No one knew that in Peter's next dream, he saw that unfamiliar night sky again, and those lingering memories became clear in the dream. He heard 2 gunshots and saw a string of scattered pearl necklaces. In his hazy dream, the previous dream seemed to return. Peter saw another world, another father and son, holding hands, slowly walking towards the universe. He saw it, behind that dark tide, those good times that perhaps even the bat itself couldn't find. 226000001 R. The Bat Incident, the End. Chapter 143, It's Useful, Part 1. In the bustling press conference venue, all the guests attending the conference were dressed in suits and ties, including many important figures. The seats on the left were occupied by high-ranking military and political figures, including a White House advisor, while the seats on the right were occupied by prominent business figures, including Pepper and Stark, Osborne, the head of Hammer Industries, and the owners of more than 20 companies of various sizes. The people in the right rear row are academics, including Schiller, Strange, Connors, Ethan, and more than 30 other PhD holders or professors from well-known universities. The 2 rows behind them probably have hundreds of PhDs combined. Strange and Schiller sat together on the far right behind Stark. Both were dressed in suits and sat upright in their chairs. Strange didn't even turn his head, but whispered to Schiller, "That so-called theory about the repair effect of immortality factors on the nervous system is such nonsense that I can't even read it aloud." Whenever you can't read any further, just think about the last string of numbers in the contract. So for the next few months, I had to be in these kinds of situations every day, like a con man or charlatan, Reciting those completely nonsensical theories? No, you have much more to do in the next few months, such as leaving your job and moving, and most importantly, counting your money. At this point, the host of the press conference invited Strange to the stage. Strange stood up, straightened his suit and tie, and then, holding a speech, walked to the front of the stage. Just like the research findings previously announced by the Stark Industries and the Osborne Industries, as an expert in the field of neurosurgery, after obtaining valuable experimental samples, I also discovered the secrets of the human body's self-repair and reverse aging. Stark, who was dozing off in the audience, was patted on the shoulder by Pepper. He jolted awake, rubbed his eyes, looked around, and noticed that the chair next to Schiller was empty. He quietly walked over, sat down next to Schiller and said, "How much money did you promise him to be able to say such lies without batting an eye? In short, it's much higher than his salary. I thought he would be the kind of person with some career ambitions. Of course he is. He calls himself the world's best neurosurgeon, and it's true. You must have heard of him, right? God's gift to the medical community. That's quite a boast. I haven't even called myself God's gift to the scientific community yet. I promised him a number he couldn't refuse, and then hired him as the head physician at the new sanatorium. You know, he's a big name, good enough for the job. And what about you? I thought you would personally serve as the attending physician." "No, I am the hospital director. I don't have time to treat patients personally. I have many other things to do." "You two are unscrupulous quacks," Stark concluded. "Anyone who goes to your hospital is really unlucky." After a while, Strange finally finished speaking. When he returned, he found that Stark had taken his seat. He and Stark stared at each other, neither willing to give in. In the end, Dr. Ethan, who was sitting next to him, moved another chair for Strange. Strange told Stark, "You better make sure the salary your so-called conglomerate pays me is commensurate with my brain, which is tainted by these lousy theories." Stark snorted dismissively and said, "Your annual salary isn't even as much as the Stark Industries earn in a minute." "Don't say that." Then Schiller comforted Strange. "I'll introduce you to Congressman Porter later. He's very interested in immortality factors and happens to be looking for a private wellness consultant." "Wait a minute." Stark looked at Schiller with a puzzled expression and said, "What? Is there something to do with senators? You two aren't trying to get paid from multiple sources, are you? You two are consultants for the United Corporation, and both the Osborne Corporation and I pay you salaries. You're also employed by S.H.I.E.L.D., so Nick should also be paying you. There should be a portion of your salary in the construction funds for the nursing home. And now you're going to get to know a senator." Strange's eyes lit up and he said, "I think it's necessary to broaden one's career path appropriately." Schiller wholeheartedly agreed, saying, "That's right, and they begged us to do it. The gentlemen on Capitol Hill all wanted to know some information about the drug for me in advance. But you have to understand, I'm just a psychiatrist and don't understand the specific medical principles. At this time, I always need some professionals to help me. By the way, Stephen, you and Dr. Connors should coordinate your statements later. Those congressmen have their own health consultants. They're your enemies." Strange scoffed and said, "I'm just pretending to be a con man, and those health consultants are a bunch of ignorant, real con men." Then he leaned slightly towards Schiller and asked in a low voice, "Was what Stark just said true? You're planning to collect money from multiple sources." "Not me, but us." Schiller leaned closer, and the two whispered together. Schiller said, "When a new technology that can change the future of humanity comes to market, what do you think is the most needed right now?" Before Strange could answer, Schiller replied, "Every power wants someone to explain to them what this is and what changes it will bring. As those who were truly involved in the research, we have the clearest and most explicit right to interpret it. Everyone is vying for it. We not only collect money from multiple sources, but we also serve whoever offers the highest price." "But I can't really explain anything," Strange said. "I've seen Connor's research report. We haven't actually cracked this thing. You don't need a real explanation. Just use the technical terms you know and repeatedly emphasize one sentence. It works. Remember, this will be the main theme for the next few months. Repeat, it works. Does it really work? Don't ask such a stupid question." Schiller glanced around at the members of parliament in suits and military representatives in uniform. He said, "We're just heartless harvesting machines. What does it matter to you how long these rich and powerful leaks live?" "I really like your attitude." Strange tilted his head and said, It seems I misunderstood you before. We still have a lot in common. Don't forget, once you've completed your resignation procedures at the Presbyterian Hospital, you should immediately start working at the sanatorium. The positions for the next 2 months are fully booked, and you'll be very busy from now on. So what about splitting it up? Just like we agreed. Stark overheard the two of them whispering for a long time. He was curious about what they were talking about, but he was too embarrassed to openly eavesdrop. So he pretended to be disdainful and said, "You two unscrupulous quacks, you can't possibly be saying anything good." Strange and Schiller exchanged a glance and said, "We might be unscrupulous, but definitely not a quack." After the press conference, Schiller led Strange to the Shield Reception Center office. Nick was waiting for them in the office. As soon as Schiller walked in, Nick came up and shook hands with Strange, saying, "This must be the general consultant for the Immortal Factor product line? Hello, I'm Nick Fury." Strange looked around the Shield office, but before he could even voice his questions, Schiller said directly to Nick, "The sanatorium should be nearing completion, right? When will it open?" The former owner of that old bank took great care of it. In fact, there wasn't much that needed to be repaired, and it could be opened in about a week. So, is the ribbon-cutting ceremony all arranged? Nick and Schiller walked to a table and sat down facing each other, with Strange sitting next to them. "No problem, everyone who needs to attend will attend. In addition, the follow-up construction plan for the nursing home has been put on the agenda. However, you will have to talk to Stark and Osborne Group about these follow-up constructions, as they are the real investors. Also," Nick said, looking at Schiller, "what do you plan to name this sanatorium? We can't just call it the Immortal Factor Sanatorium, can we?" Schiller laughed and said, "How about calling it Arkham Sanatorium? Arkham? That should be a surname, right?" Nick paused for a moment after saying that, then looked at the ring on Schiller's hand with Strange. Schiller continued, "It was just a joke. The name doesn't matter. You can decide." No, I'm sorry, you don't need to explain why. The naming right is yours. You can name it whatever you want." Schiller glanced at the two of them. Nick and Strange's expressions were very strange, and he knew that the two must have misunderstood something. When everyone's attitude towards a misunderstanding is, "No, you don't need to explain," it's already very difficult to clarify. And when they adopt an attitude of I understand everything, there's no point in even thinking about clarifying it. Nick and Strange both knew about the source of Schiller's cryogenic technology. Schiller claimed, "I have a friend." But the more he said that, the more everyone felt he was hiding something. I have a friend. Well, those who know, know. In any case, the name was decided so hastily that, on the day the Arkham Sanatorium opened, no one knew why it was called Arkham. Schiller had previously kept a low profile. He was not as famous in the medical field as Strange, and he mostly stayed behind the scenes. Apart from a few key figures, others did not know much about him. As a result, most people assumed that the dean's surname was Arkham, so Schiller directly lost his real name and most people called him Dean Arkham, instead of Dean Rodriguez. The day of the opening ceremony of Arkham Sanatorium was a rare sunny day. At the ceremony, Schiller invited all his friends in the world and gave them intensive training the night before. "Yes, I'm sure it works. Although I'm in charge of pathology research, I've also learned about some of the classified research findings, so I can certainly tell you that." "Oh, right. That's right, I'm a high school student and I'm just helping Dr. Connors in the lab." "What? I've seen the actual report? I can't tell you that, it's confidential." "Well, I can only tell you that with so many researchers working on this, it can't be completely useless, right? Indeed, I am a PhD in physics, but I think you have a misunderstanding of the scope of physics. I did participate in this experiment, especially in the research and development of medical devices targeting the immortality factor. Do you think I would spend so much energy on something useless? Longevity? You're being far too conservative in your assessment of its effects, sir. As a psychology expert, I can tell you with certainty that it's also effective in regulating emotions. Anyway, don't ask so many questions. I'm Stark. If Stark tells you it works, then it works. I think you heard me." "Yes, that's right. That's what we all say. Is there a problem with this? Do I have to emphasize this again? It is certainly effective. It works." Chapter 144, It's Useful. Part 2. The old bank, which was converted into Arkham Asylum, is located in the southern financial district of Lower Manhattan, but not on Wall Street. It is on the east corner of an intersection at 14th Street. It was built in the 1930s by a British businessman who came to invest here. So it looks a bit like Gringotts Bank from Harry Potter, with white walls and elaborate window decorations. As Nick Fury said, the building is very well maintained, both the exterior and the interior. Its interior is mostly furnished with wooden furniture, and the lobby is very well lit thanks to the many floor-to-ceiling windows. The revolving door, reminiscent of the last century, has been preserved. Upon entering, you are greeted by the main counter, flanked by two massive staircases. Crystal chandeliers hang overhead, and the wooden floor beneath your feet is a mature honey color, bearing traces of history without appearing worn or old. The building is not symmetrical. The main building is on the east side, so most of the sanatorium rooms are on the east side, while the outpatient department and functional buildings are on the west side. Because this old bank is not on Wall Street, the land was purchased at a low price and has a relatively spacious layout with 7 floors. There are about 60 usable rooms on the east side and more than 30 on the west side. There is also a sky garden on the 3rd floor behind the 2nd floor on the west side. The people who built this bank were also very willing to spend money. The interior is very luxurious, and the style is extravagant and comfortable. It is a building that is very much in line with the aesthetics of the old money of that era. Therefore, it does not need much decoration and directly satisfies the aesthetics and practicality of a sanatorium. As Strange walked down the corridor on the 3rd floor of the hospital, a nurse behind him flipped through her notebook and said, "Mr. Eisen on the 2nd floor wants to drink special drinking water, and Mrs. Harris on the 3rd floor wants us to prescribe eye drops containing immortality factors. I need to go to a meeting with the dean now. We'll talk about these things after the meeting." Strange went upstairs, turned left, and went to the dean's office on the far east side of the 4th floor. When he entered, Schiller was opening champagne. Strange said irritably, "Aren't you a little too early to be opening champagne now? There's a huge mess to clean up." He slammed a stack of documents onto the table in front of Schiller and said, "You've been so busy taking in so many patients who have made appointments that the sanatorium's office system isn't even fully developed yet. Suddenly, 50 or 60 patients have flooded in, and the doctors and nurses are going crazy. Don't rush." Schiller slowly took 2 glasses from the cabinet, then pointed to the chair, gesturing for Strange to sit down. He poured himself a glass, then poured one for Strange and said, "The SHIELD agents are already in training, and a batch should arrive this afternoon." "Special agents? The medical staff you told me about this morning who were urgently dispatched. Are they special agents?" "Of course, and not only do they not charge me a salary, Nick even pays me money." Strange opened his mouth. He wasn't stupid. He knew exactly what the agents were there for. He said, "You sold patients' private information to the intelligence organization?" "Stephen, look up. Where are the patients here? They consume the most expensive health products in the world, and even for a minor scrape, they have the best private doctors to treat them." Schiller, with one hand in his pocket and the other holding a wine glass, took a sip and said, "They didn't come here for treatment. Of course I know they're here because of that fabricated theory of immortality factors you made up, and they want to use it to make themselves immortal," Strange scoffed. Schiller shook his head, put down his glass and said, "That's only one aspect. Have you heard of Noah's Ark? God wanted to destroy the world with a flood, so he built an ark. The ark could only hold a limited number of people, and only a very small number of people were able to survive. When things got to this point, what happened after boarding the ship was no longer important. What mattered was that they were willing to spend a lot of money to buy tickets to prove to the world that they were God's favorites. If you were the captain of Noah's Ark, no matter how well you sailed the ship, God wouldn't let a vampire like you in." Strange also picked up his glass and took a sip. "How many more medical staff do you need?" Strange thought for a moment, then said, "We need at least 50. There are almost no people on the 3rd and 4th floors to accompany them. They are all clamoring for private nurses. I'm not asking about the fewest, but the most. At most? How many people can a 7-story nursing home fit in at most? Probably 1,000 medical staff would be enough to fill it up, right? You don't get a share of the money for arranging agents to enter the sanatorium. That's my compensation. However, you can take 5% of the reimbursement for the falsely reported number of people." "We absolutely need at least 5,000 people," Strange said firmly. "Patients have paid a lot of money, and each person needs at least a medical team of 200 people to care for them 24 hours a day. Is there still room for improvement?" Strange rested his elbows on the table and propped his chin on his hand, saying, That depends on whether you can get the accreditation for a medical or pharmaceutical research institute. There's no limit to the number of people in such an institution. I could even apply for 20,000. 20,000 people? 2 researchers and 19,998 assistants. Internship slots. Strange emphasized. How many people does Columbia University have? How about New York University? If we approve internship slots for them, let alone 20,000, if New York has a few more universities, 100,000 would be reasonable. Wait a minute. Strange suddenly realized that he seemed to have been led astray by Schiller. He said, even if you're taking money from multiple sources, you don't have to go this far, do you? You took money from these customers, fed them health products with questionable efficacy, and even took money from intelligence organizations to send people in to gather intelligence. You! Strange didn't even know how to describe Schiller. Calling him a vampire would make any vampire weep. If any vampire had even half of his wickedness, he wouldn't have ended up as an ingredient in health supplements. As Strange was thinking, there was a knock on the door of the dean's office. A man in a trench coat and hood walked in. Schiller took a glass from the liquor cabinet and poured a glass of champagne. The man took off his hood, revealing himself to be Blade. I didn't understand a word you said on the phone, Blade said, somewhat doubtfully. But are you sure what I'm doing will work? Of course, of course. Schiller pulled up a chair for him, gesturing for him to sit down. After Blade sat down, Schiller said, what could be more compelling evidence than vampires themselves coming forward to prove that the immortality factor within vampires is effective? But I'm not a vampire. I've never even been bitten, it's just my mother. That's it. When you tell the story later, you must emphasize this point. After your mother was bitten, you were born as a vampire. What does this mean? Schiller looked at Strange, who was also a little confused. He said, what does this prove? It proves that vampires are vicious, even biting pregnant women. No, this proves that a certain substance in vampire blood can be transmitted from mother to child, which will be welcomed by the high-end maternal and infant market. Next question, Eric. How old are you this year? I forgot, but she should be in her 30s, right? No, you are almost 230 years old this year, which is about the same year the United States was founded. You were born with the Union. But I'm not that old. That's not old. You're in your prime among vampires. There must be plenty of 3,000 or 4,000-year-olds in your clan, right? As far as I know, apart from Dracula, there doesn't seem to be. By the way, Dracula, is he the oldest? Do you have his contact information? What do you want to do? Blade asked Schiller, who replied, if he's willing to record a promotional video for us, he can name his price. Let a vampire promote a potion made from himself? What are you thinking? How could he possibly agree to that? But you're already here, aren't you? My situation is special. I hate these rats. They are my enemies. I wish humans would kill them all. Then how do you know that you're the only one with a special situation? Schiller said very sincerely, Eric, you must know that your strength alone is not enough. I heard you have connections with the clan. You could ask the moderates how they plan to deal with the radicals. If you don't mind, I can discuss a business deal with them. Talk business? What do you plan to talk about? Hand over their political enemies to me. I can give them 20% of the profits from selling the finished drug. That's already a lot. Nick can only take 30%. Blade opened his mouth, paused, and then said, this is absurd. But, Blade said with some doubt, it is indeed a bit strange. Humans are promoting a drug made from vampires on a large scale. I thought the moderates would start protesting one after another. Perhaps you haven't thought about it, but those vampires who have the ability to speak don't care if their fellow vampires are turned into medicine, as long as it's not them who are turned into medicine. On this basis, it would be even better if their enemy were the one made into medicine. And if the whole process doesn't even require them to take action, but only requires providing humanity with a little bit of intelligence and information to completely strike at their political enemies, keeping them busy and even annihilating them all, then why not do it? If they not only don't have to put in any effort during this process, but can also gain a lot of money and resources, then why wouldn't they be tempted? Ultimately, Schiller concluded, moderate vampires are just pleasure-seeking. To enjoy themselves in human society, they need status and money. They want these things, so we provide them with them in exchange for the enemies of their own kind. Once they get used to this luxurious lifestyle, and all the radicals have been eliminated, They will spontaneously select a portion of the group and send them to us in exchange for the capital needed to continue maintaining this extravagant lifestyle. Under the rule of pure blood theory, their society will be gradually sacrificed to humanity from the bottom up. Perhaps, Schiller sighed and said, in this world, there will only be one vampire in the beginning and in the end, and that is the immortal Dracula. Strange and Blade were both silent. After a while, Strange said, I don't care about these big things. I'm just an ordinary doctor. I want to know, what good will this do me? You have already become the chief physician of this sanatorium. No matter how it is divided up, you will not be left out. This is the benefit that an entire race can bring. What you need to do now is think about how big a villa you would be to lie in and count your money so that you would be more comfortable. Strange swallowed hard. He could hardly imagine such a life, but he still said with composure, I'm not that greedy for money. I'm a man with aspirations. Blade shook his head and said, Money? Money is a terrible thing, but it works. Schiller picked up his glass, the golden liquid reflecting off his glasses, obscuring his eyes. It is very useful, and it will always be useful. Chapter 145 It's Useful. Part 2. New York City is always brightly lit at night. In the most bustling Manhattan neighborhoods, the lights stay on all night. Amidst the traffic and the dazzling colors of the neon lights, a long black luxury car drives through the curtain of countless colors and stops in front of a luxurious mansion. The waiter opened the car door, and Schiller got out. He followed the guide into the elevator, which slowly rose until the doors opened again, and the brilliant lights of the corridor poured in. As he stepped out of the elevator, Schiller squinted. Turning a corner in the corridor, Schiller entered a room where he saw a very imposing figure standing in front of a floor-to-ceiling window, overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Dean, you've arrived. The man turned around. He was obese like a sumo wrestler with a face full of fat. He spoke in a loud and imposing voice. Hello, Mr. Kingpin. Kingpin stood there, hands behind his back, looked Schiller up and down and said, the famous director of Arkham Asylum. You're not actually named Arkham, are you? That's right, Mr. Kingpin. It seems you know me quite well. Schiller walked up to Kingpin, looked at him and said, So, what brings you here tonight? Kingpin turned around, took a few steps to the side and said with his head down, If you were really just a sanatorium director, I wouldn't have invited you here. Before Schiller could speak, Kingpin continued, Many strange things have happened recently, and it seems as if there is an invisible rope connecting them all. People always focus on Stark or S.H.I.E.L.D., or even Spider-Man and Daredevil, but I'm different. I'm really interested in this invisible rope. Don't you think, Dean Arkham? Just say what you have to say, Schiller said bluntly. Since you've already invited me here, it means you must have found the rope. Not many people can do that, and this is the ticket you deserve. Kingpin suddenly turned around, staring intently at Schiller, and said, Give me tickets? To the underground king of the East Coast? What gives you the audacity to speak so arrogantly? If you don't want it, there's no need to invite me here. I don't believe that the king of the underworld on the East Coast only knows my real name after all that investigation. All right, looks like I didn't pick the wrong person. Kingpin turned around and walked over, then said, You created the immortality factor? Of course not. It exists in vampire blood. Don't give me that nonsense. We all know it's just hype. Really? Why do you think vampires can live forever? Kingpin stared intently at Schiller, seemingly trying to read something from his face, but Schiller remained expressionless. Finally, Kingpin asked, Do you really possess the technology for immortality? Schiller smiled and said, Do you still think I'm talking nonsense now? I admit it's too tempting. No one would not want to live forever. When you asked me that question just now, for a moment, I really believed it. I'm not joking, nor am I testing you, Schiller told Kingpin. I can provide a batch of about 1,500 vials of the drug, and I'm sure they will have an extremely noticeable effect. Kingpin sat down behind the solid wood table in the room, and Schiller sat down in front of him. Schiller said, I'm not here to act as a salesperson, and we're not in a seller-buyer relationship. We can be sellers together. What's the meaning? Hand Society, Dragon Bone. Kingpin frowned and said, You know more than I thought. After all, I didn't come to this appointment just because I knew the name Kingpin. As far as I know, the greatest benefit of Dragon Bone is longevity. The Hand seeks out this kind of thing to extend the lifespan of their high-ranking members. To this end, They even went so far as to send out hundreds or thousands of assassins to search for this material all over the world at any cost. Prolonging life. Although I don't know what kind of effect the dragon bone can achieve, at least in the early stages, it certainly won't be better than the potion I have. Kingpin narrowed his eyes, sensing something strange in Schiller's words. As the de facto king of the underground world on the East Coast, he was all too familiar with that tone. He straightened up, placed his arms on the table, and then said, "What benefits will I gain from cooperating with you? Give up your dead-end drug-into-schools plan. It won't change anything. It's the worst way to expand your market. It seems you have quite a relationship with those two annoying flies. As long as you can successfully sell these 1,500 vials of the potion to the hand, and of course we'll take half the profit, then soon, some precious bad ingredients will be circulating in the underground market you control." Sure enough, the bad ingredients that the media were promoting, with only 2 left, were just a gimmick you used for hype. Once business negotiations began, Kingpin was extremely insistent on every penny, saying, "Besides that, you must provide me personally with a whole bat, the same kind of bat you used to extract that medicine. Excuse me for being frank, but even if I provided it to you, you wouldn't have any technical ability to crack its secrets. You don't need to worry about that. At most, I can only give you some research samples from Stark Labs, including blood and organs, as well as epidermal tissue. The complete Batman is with Nick Fury, he's a greedy vampire. You can't sway him unless you offer him something good enough. I only want a whole bat, that's my absolute bottom line. Otherwise there's nothing to talk about," Kingpin said. "It seems we can only discuss this condition later, or you can give Nick a call." Seeing Schiller's unwavering stance, Kingpin guessed that Nick might not have much bat material left. Moreover, although Schiller had facilitated the cooperation between Shield Stark and the Osborn Corporation, there must have been a process of exchanging bargaining chips between the two sides. Now it seemed that the raw material chip had all fallen into Nick's hands, and Schiller, as the middleman, probably had no say in the matter. "Okay, I don't need the whole bats, but the research samples you provide must be brand new and consist of no less than 2/3 of the bats. Make a deal." Then Kingpin asked Schiller, "What did you do with those 1,500 vials of medicine you planned to sell to the hand?" Schiller shook his head and said, "I wouldn't be so stupid as to poison it or do anything else. I know you're worried that the hand's fierce retaliation will cause you heavy losses. But you can randomly sample any of the 1,500 vials of medicine I provide. I guarantee there are no harmful substances in them. I'm starting to get confused about what you're trying to do. Is this a scheme orchestrated by the director of S.H.I.E.L.D.? Is he finally going to target the hand? Why can't you take your eyes off these fighting and killings?" Schiller said with some helplessness. "Can't I just really want to do business with the Shuheiwi?" Kingpin snorted and said, "Nick Fury must be getting annoyed with these fleas. If it weren't for their ninjas being so hard to kill, S.H.I.E.L.D. agents would have already come knocking on his door. That was in the past. Garbage was just a resource in the wrong place." Finally, Schiller said to Kingpin, "If you want to continue expanding your underground empire, I have some good suggestions, but that will be at an extra cost and will be after our collaboration. If you are interested, come find me at Arkham Sanatorium." After leaving, Schiller was picked up by a S.H.I.E.L.D. car and taken to Nick Fury's office. The two didn't say anything, but walked together towards the S.H.I.E.L.D. underground. After being transported through several enclosed elevators, the two arrived at a huge underground factory. The conveyor belts there were all made up of cryogenic chambers, and inside those chambers were large, frozen bats. The snow storage area of the entire underground factory covers thousands of square meters and is filled with countless frozen bats. Schiller took a report from an agent, glanced at it, and said, "Kingpin has a longer-term vision than I thought." He readily agreed to the collaboration. What conditions did he propose? "He needs samples from 2/3 of the bats." Nick almost burst out laughing when he saw the mountain of bat-shaped frozen storage bins in the underground factory's snow storage area. He could imagine that Kingpin and Schiller must have gone through several rounds of negotiations and bargaining before finally reaching this result. Perhaps this underground king was still smug, having obtained 2/3 of the 2 bats that were only available as raw materials, attracting the attention of countless powerful and wealthy people. Nick even felt a little sorry for Kingpin. Schiller was not surprised. He simply looked at the report and said, "The black market can't be all genuine goods. We need to mix in some fakes and then develop a set of standards to distinguish the genuine products." "Fake goods? You mean?" "That's right. We divide the bats that are to be distributed into 2 types. Although they are essentially the same, One batch has anti-counterfeiting marks and the other batch does not. Among those with anti-counterfeiting marks, we add some so-called exclusive marks or origin markings, then mix them together and circulate them on the black market. You're really ruthless, Nick exclaimed. So the ineffective immortality factors they bought were all fake. That's right, it's your own fault for not coming to our sanatorium for treatment. You deserve to buy counterfeit goods. The sanatorium has no beds. But what can I do? The sanatorium is short of funds and we desperately need donations. If you don't donate and I don't donate, then you'll have no choice but to buy those fake immortality factors on the market. I think your choice of the black market under Kingpin's control is more than just that, isn't it? I have a feeling you're trying to trick him. Nick crossed his arms, looked at the cryogenic chamber on the conveyor belt and said, I don't believe you'd be so kind as to know that the other party is an insatiable crocodile and still drag him in to share the cake. We currently lack some means to protect this nascent industry, not only overt legal means, but also some covert means. I'm just tying this crocodile next to this cake so that it can deter all other people who want to take the cake. Schiller paused for a moment, then continued, I don't have any good feelings towards King. Not because he's the king of the criminal empire. Whether he is a gang leader or a criminal kingpin is not important to me. I don't think he's a good partner because he's too superstitious about force and thinks that assassination can solve everything. We're not on the same wavelength. Indeed, Nick looked at Schiller and said, You didn't assassinate anyone, but it seems like you've solved all the problems. But like I said, Schiller put down the report, looked at the underground factory and said, Garbage is a resource in the wrong place and so is Kingpin. At least for now, he's useful. That's enough.